So I like to start off with the words liberal and conservative, because almost every political thing starts off with liberal and conservative. And so what I hope to show you is that behavior is really a function of our voting system. Our current voting system tends to polarize society, and there are much better ways that are really easy to implement. There are lots of ways to improve it, but I'm going to settle on approval voting as the one that just offers dramatic improvements for just a really simple change. So here's the sort of things that we're going to be talking about. Now I have 26 slides, and it'll take somewhere between 40 and 50 minutes to go through them, and they'll answer some of your frequent questions, like does it let third parties have a chance, and how does it compare to ranked choice voting? But there should be about 20 minutes at the end for questions. And I'm going to be talking a lot about spoilers and vote splitting, because that's the two main failure mechanisms of our current system. I'm going to give a lot of examples of that. But what you don't see is that because of spoilers and splitting, a lot of people just don't run at all, because they learned their lesson from Teddy Roosevelt, who ran against Howard Taft. And that's happened over and over again. And then there's a thing called Duverger's law that was discovered in 1840 by this French guy. And it basically means in a choose one system, two parties become dominant. And I'll show examples of how that happened. And the result is that society becomes polarized, and we talk more about our differences and things that we really need to fix, and the things that can be fixed. So first I'll go through examples of the famous vote splits and spoils of history, and show just how big a problem this is, because we tend to forget, except for the most recent election, but I'll start with the most recent election. This one can be analyzed in so many ways. And of course the media, the media can say the Russians did it. And that's one way. You can also say the Electoral College did it. Or Facebook did it. But look at all the third-party support here. It could also be argued that this was a spoiler effect, and that if these third parties didn't exist, that the results would have been different. So that's typical of it. Now this one's a little dubious as to whether it's a true spoiler effect. But this one is interesting. Now, despite the Nader supporters, most people say this is the classic spoiler effect. And they point to Nader as a classic spoiler. And Nader supporters tend to think, oh, what a slap in the face for doing this. And a lot of people say Nader was terrible, but it's really the voting system that's terrible. It wasn't Nader that was terrible. He was just trying to advance his ideas, and he had some good ideas. But it ended up, under our current voting system, electing a dubious candidate. Now, if you want something less controversial, you go back 100 years to Grover Cleveland. He knew about the spoiler effect, and there was a Prohibition party at the time. And he knew that he was just running neck and neck with Blaine for the state of New York, which would determine the election. So he funded St. John, the Prohibition campaign, to give St. John a little more oomph in New York. And that flipped New York to Grover Cleveland and got Cleveland elected. So because it's a little older, we tend to forget about it. I'm just covering some of the famous ones. There are about 60,000 elections a year in the U.S., about 10,000 of which have multiple candidates running for a single office, which is what this talk is about. A lot of them are yes/no questions on propositions and whether a judge should be elected. Okay. This is a really classic vote split. New York State in 1970, it was pretty much the same politics it is now. It's a liberal state. And yet 2 liberals decided to run for the Senate office. And they ended up splitting the liberal vote and gave the win to Buckley. What was his first name? William Buckley. Yeah. So this is what really got 2 professors at New York State riled up, and they started doing research on approval. Well, they started researching all possible voting methods, and they zeroed in very quickly on approval voting. And I'll be getting to that in about 4 slides. So that's it. So the word to remember is vote split as opposed to vote spoiling, spoiler. So this is a case where it's in that gray area between a split and a spoil. So George Wallace, he really didn't have a chance. So in that respect, you would call him a spoiler. But he did take over 13% of the national vote. Well, remember that Lincoln was a Republican, and the Republicans hadn't won the South since the Civil War. It's been purely Democratic. And then 1968 comes along, and George Wallace takes the South. And he takes enough votes so Hubert Humphrey no longer wins the South, and that's enough to push Nixon over the top. So it's sort of a spoiler, sort of a split. But the other thing it illustrates is the response of the electorate to this sort of situation. You see, the Republicans realized, oh, this is really useful. We can get people in the White House if we just suck in the George Wallace voters. And that's how you get 2 parties dominating. So if one party absorbs any party that they think will help it. So Wallace really didn't have a chance as an independent, but absorbed into the Republican Party, he did have a chance. So again, if you study American history in high school, you probably learned about this one. Teddy Roosevelt in 1912 decided, oh yeah, I really could run for another term. And he didn't like his progressive party. He's a Republican, right? Yeah. But they were both progressive. Taft was a really heavy guy. And he didn't like Taft, so he said, I'm going to just form my own party, and I can beat them. And sure enough, he beat Taft, running with his own party. But it wasn't enough. Basically, they split the progressive vote. Yes?
Was Taft running as a Republican?
Well, remember, he has to have a mic, so repeat the question.
I can repeat it. Was Taft running as a Republican? I think so, but somebody Google that, and we'll get an authoritative answer. Yeah. But mainly back then, Republican meant progressive at that moment in history.
Hold on a second. Hold it. Can we not have questions from the audience until later, or do you want to do it that way?
My talk should take about 40 minutes, and then we'll have questions, because this subject, everybody has input on this subject. Okay, so one more example from history, although these are only the really important ones. Well, this is actually 2 examples, 1856 and 1860. The slavery was the issue of 1856 and 60. And so in 1856, there were 3 candidates, a pro-slavery, anti-slavery, and a know-nothing, which means they didn't want to have a stance on slavery. And they end up splitting the vote, and the pro-slavery candidate wins in 1856. So. And then in 1860, they had 4 candidates. They still had pro-slavery and know-nothing, but this guy was with the Democratic Party, a division of the Democratic Party, so they split it 4 ways. And with that split, it turned out the split went the other way. So splitting sort of gives you a randomizing effect. In this case, it went slavery. In this case, it went anti-slavery. And of course, that was unacceptable to the South, and the Civil War started a month after Lincoln took office. Okay, so here's a repeat of the first slide. So now you know what spoilers and splitters are. So that's active, but the inactive thing is that good people don't run, and indirectly that suppresses third parties and new ideas in the system. And then indirectly we start polarizing society. Negative campaigning becomes a good way to win, because the only way you can get a vote is to take a vote away from the other guy. So that's a description of the nature of the problem and how big it is. So now the next part of the talk is about ways to fix it. And we've been patching it ever since the nation was formed. And we're just now starting to think about converting to other systems.
Can you explain a different system?
Oh yeah, I've got slides on that. I will explain at least 3 other systems. There are dozens of other systems, but I'll cover 3 of the main ones. Okay. So these are patches that you can make. One is that if you can get it down to 2 people on the ballot, then our current system works just fine. So you just make it harder to get on the ballot, and maybe you can get it down to 3 or 4 at least. Now, somewhere in the 1820s, we started having primaries. There's nothing in the Constitution that says you have primaries, but people said, you got to have primaries. You got to get the field down, or else you'll have too many vote splits and spoilers. And then later on, we found out the people were winning with 40% of the vote. And we said, oh, that's not right. They should have a majority. So if no one wins with 50% of the vote, we'll have a runoff. So some states have runoffs. And each one of these adds another couple of weeks to the election while they print out new ballots and do another election. But primaries are pretty standard. Runoffs are maybe 10% of the states have those. And then the idea was that, oh, well, if runoffs will solve the problem, then let's just do it ahead of time and have everybody decide ahead of time what they would vote for if they had a runoff. And that's called ranked choice voting. And that's such a... that idea really grabs you. In fact, I went through about a month or so when I thought, oh, wow, that's a great idea. And then, so I have 4 slides on what that is. It's an improvement, just like primaries, but it has its problems. So I've got 4 slides on it. So ranked choice voting has various ways of happening, but it's often called instant runoff, although many other ways will have instant runoffs too, like approval voting will do instant runoffs. So you're basically deciding how you would vote if there was a runoff ahead of time. It was invented about 150 years ago, and types of it are used in Australia and Ireland, although they have a lot of other things that are different. Notice that 150 years ago we didn't have computers to do statistical analyses, so a lot of it was seat of pants. In the U.S., there are about 10 cities that utilize it, and Maine adopted it fairly recently. So it's much better known than approval voting. And this is how the main ballot looked the first time they used approval voting last time. So you end up with a spreadsheet. In this case, they had 7 candidates, and you got to have a room for a write-in, so it's an 8x8 spreadsheet. And you mark who's your first in this column, and who's your second choice in this column, and who's your third in this column. And the idea is that if your first choice doesn't win, doesn't get 50% of the vote, then the vote counter goes to your second choice. Well, what it does is it eliminates the candidate that got the lowest number of votes. Say this candidate, if this one got the lowest number of votes, then it looks at those ballots and picks out their second choice. And then if you still don't have someone winning with 50%, then it eliminates the next lowest candidate. And you keep going until you have someone with 50% of the vote. And so for this election, that took 6 rounds before they got to a candidate with. And the recent mayor election in San Francisco took. I actually don't know because the mayor election in San Francisco took 6 rounds. And while a computer could probably automate this really quick, it ends up taking, well, in the early Maine elections, it took a month. They got it down to a week. But it is a difficult process just to count the votes. But it's so complicated that it takes a little analysis, and this next slide shows a particular analysis. So the hope is that ranked choice voting solves the vote splitting and spoiling problem. And this is an example of how it handles, a graphical example of how it handles a vote split. And so what we have is an election for the capital of Tennessee, and the voters vote in their self-interest, so they vote for the city that's closest to them. And there are 4 major cities in Tennessee. Memphis is the largest, Nashville's second largest, Knoxville has 17% of the voters, and Chattanooga 15%. So like Knoxville would be, their voters would put them first, and then Chattanooga, and then Nashville and Memphis last in a ranked choice vote. So this is a graphical way of seeing how the system would work. So in round 1, the first place voters just go by population. Memphis would win. And if there was, that's the way it would be if it was just one round of regular voting too. Memphis would be the capital. But no one has 50%, so Chattanooga gets eliminated. And its 15% goes to the next closest city, which is Knoxville. So Knoxville rolls up to 32%. So in round 2 of the vote, Knoxville's at 32%, and that beats out Nashville. And so in round 3, Nashville's eliminated, and Nashville's votes roll over to Knoxville, so it ends up with 58% of the vote. And Memphis comes in second with 42%. So that took, 3-4 minutes to understand. A lot of people don't go through that. They think that this solves vote splitting. But basically what happened is that Nashville and Memphis split in the middle, and the system keeps rolling through, and it ends up with Knoxville being the capital, the winner. And there's similar analyses that show that ranked choice doesn't solve the spoiling problem either. Now, in California, we have 2 types of cities, those with their own charter and those that use a standard charter from the state of California. So San Francisco has its own charter, but little cities often just use a standard charter from the state. And both of our governors have vetoed ranked choice voting. And this is quotes from Jerry Brown and Gavin Newsom. Now, I wish they would go into more detail as to what these quotes mean, but this is really all I know. They wrote this in the veto letter. It's so beguiling to think that ranked choice is going to solve the problem, and I hope that Jerry Brown, Governor Newsom understand all this stuff, but in a way that's what the Center for Election Science is for, is to educate people. So ranked choice, it does reduce it's slightly better. It's sort of like having, it's a patch. It's like having primaries and runoffs. So it does reduce the spoiler effect, and you get the comfort factor of it having been used in Australia, although for a long time. The complexity is often cited as the main problem. If you want to grab a ballot at the end, I printed out 4 methods of voting, but this is if you had 12 candidates, you'd end up with a 12 by 12 spreadsheet that you have to fill out. And most people get tired after their third choice, and they just don't go past that. This precinct summable means that if you have precinct A, where Joe Smith is the answer, the winner, with 30, right? You can't just sum the ballots independently. They have to be sent to a central place and counted in a central location. So that's sort of a fraud detection system. And then there are examples where voting for your favorite can cause them to lose. I've got some videos on that, and I've got examples. There's lots of YouTube videos on all this stuff, but I have an example of that. It takes a couple of minutes to understand. And because the ballot is so complicated, you get more spoiled ballots. So that's my talk on ranked choice voting, but you can't really have a talk without the most popular voting method in the world. And I can say that definitely because it's the one used by Amazon. Every day, millions of people vote 0 to 5 stars on their products on Amazon. And so we're really used to score voting. Now, Amazon decides 0 to 5 stars. There's 0 to 100. The Olympics uses 0 to 10, with 10 being the maximum. So it's a good system. The statistical analysis shows that score voting works, but notice this little issue here. You see, this guy has 4.5 stars, but only 2 voters on it. And this one has 4 stars, but 19 voters. So score voting, you can get your family and friends to vote on you, and if no one else votes, you can get 5 stars. And so it has a problem finding what the true average is. But that's overcomeable. On the whole, it's an improvement. But here's a list of the pros and cons of score voting. So it does prevent vote splitting and spoilers. And it's more complicated than choose one voting, but still pretty simple. People on Amazon handle it. The voting machine people say that they can handle it without a change to the voting machines. Unlike ranked choice, if you vote for your favorite, you aren't going to prevent the favorite from being elected. And if you're a third party, you may not win, but at least you get some accurate indication of your support. And that's really important because that means you might get funded again, come back again, and advance your ideas again. It's more complex than than choose one voting. I mentioned the trouble in calculating the average score. Just a few people might make the average very high. But then this is the one that is of interest. Approval voting is basically score voting with just one level, up or nothing. So score voting becomes approval voting in many cases. And in political systems, you're often really polarized. So you vote up for the one you like the best. And so you tend to vote 5 stars for the one you like the best and 0 stars for the one you want the least. So now we have some slides on approval voting finally. And I have a video, a 2-minute video on what it is, but this is the text version of what it is. The ballot looks exactly like the ballot we have right now, except you replace the words vote for one with vote for one or more. And so instead of checking off one candidate, so right now we have, 16 people running for the Democratic nomination, and instead of checking one, you might check 5 or 10. And when Trump was running, they had 16 people going for the Republican nomination, and back then you had to check just one also. Now it's similar to thumbs up and thumbs down that's used on YouTube and Facebook. You could call thumbs up and thumbs down and nothing a 3-level score voting. Or if you forget the one in the middle, then just thumbs up, then it's approval voting. It depends on your nomenclature. Now the United Nations uses it to select the Attorney General. The Vatican did use it for the Pope. They tell me that that's changed now. The city of Venice used it for 500 years, back in the height of Venice. Now, YouTube and Facebook use the thumbs up, thumbs down system. But here's the deal. Only one city in the U.S. uses it right now. Fargo, North Dakota voted it in last year. And it looks like it'll be on the ballot this year for St. Louis. So it doesn't have the comfort factor of being used everywhere, but it's used enough places, you know. Yeah. And that's what the Center for Election Sciences is about, is showing people, well, this is really easy and it fixes a lot of problems. And then this is a list of the pros and cons. So you could argue that it's even simpler than our choose one system. And it prevents vote splitting and spoilers. So a Ralph Nader person, a certain percentage of the Ralph Nader voters would have also checked off they approve of Al Gore and vice versa. And in that way, you reduce spoilers. It doesn't require changing your voting machines. You can vote for your favorite and always vote for your favorite. This is big. Third parties get an indication. Other countries have many parties. The U.S. still dominates with 2 parties. Each precinct can count their votes, and then you can just add them together to find out who the winner is. And there's fewer spoiled votes. If you check 2, you haven't spoiled your ballot. You've just approved of 2 people. The cons, it's only used in 1 city currently. And the other con is that you don't get to express your degree of approval. So you've got to decide, do I approve of Nader or not? You don't get to say, oh, he's a 3. And people like to express themselves. So it basically relies on statistics to find out what level of approval Nader gets. So you're relying on, well, maybe half the people will approve of Nader, and etc. So some people like to express themselves. So this is a 2-minute video from the Center for Election Science that explains what approval voting is.
What is approval voting? Simply put, it's a better way to run an election. Let's take a trip to Plantsville. It's election time, and Mayor Blueberry is campaigning hard for a second term in office. She won the last election with 65% against her opponent, Mr. Squash, and she still enjoys strong support. Once again, Mr. Squash is quick to challenge Ms. Blueberry. But this time, they're joined by a third challenger, Mr. Peach, who shares similar views with Mayor Blueberry. Mr. Peach sweet-talks almost half of Blueberry's supporters into switching their vote to him, while Mr. Squash holds the same 35% he had last time. The votes are counted. And what's this? Mr. Squash wins? Blueberry and Peach have split the fruit vote. How did this happen? Peach's supporters also like Blueberry, but couldn't say so on their ballots. A simple solution is to change the ballot from vote for one to vote for one or more, allowing everyone to state all the candidates they support. This is called approval voting. With approval voting, the election would have gone quite differently. Peach's supporters no longer fear that a vote for Peach will help elect Squash. Instead, they show their sincere support for Peach and also Blueberry. They want to prevent Mr. Squash from winning, and they do. And approval voting accurately reflects Peach's support. Mayor Blueberry wins the election. Democracy is restored. Approval voting is more than just a smart idea in Plantsville. It's a smart idea anywhere you vote. Approval voting is used by organizations across the globe, and for good reason. It's democratic because the candidate with the most support wins. It removes the spoiler effect. Even losing candidates get an accurate reflection of support. And voting your favorite never hurts you. Start the conversation on approval voting and share this video. Then join the Center for Election Science at electology.org. Better voting starts with you.
Okay, so the Center of Election Science was started by nerdy people. That's why there's 4 board members in the Bay Area. We tend to be computer scientists, statisticians, and political scientists. Originally our name was Electology, and then we decided that was too academic, and even election science is getting a little flack right now. These 2 professors are the people that wrote the book on approval voting and did some of the original work. And if you listen to them, they're really soft-spoken academic types. And they've spoken to legislatures and tried to convince them, but they're so soft-spoken and academic. This is a Nobel Prize-winning economist that spoke on the positive effects of approval voting. So on YouTube, this is a discussion, a 2-hour discussion on 50 years of approval voting research. This is a book. It's really academic, so I apologize for that. There are many videos on YouTube. I can play this one. It's, I think, a 3-minute video, but I won't do it right now. It turns out with instant runoff voting, if you vote for your favorite, you can end up electing someone that you don't like. So you have to be strategic in your voting and decide, is it safe to vote for this person? And then there's a really good video on the election science channel and on YouTube called On Duverger's Law that show how you get 2 major parties under a choose one voting system. By the way, a lot of these election voting things have French names because the French Revolution happened and the French were having had a lot of mathematicians at the time, and so you'll see a lot of French names thrown around with voting systems. And there's a lot of buzzwords too, but at least you know what spoilers and splitting. I've been using choose one. I think that's the best name for our current voting method, but it's also called plurality, which I find hard to understand, and it's called first past the post. So if you look in the literature, it'll be confusing because there's so many names being thrown around. All right, it's going to. And then there are various podcasts. I did one on Matt Courtney's channel about a month ago. This is one that our executive director did. 80,000 Hours is the podcast of the Effective Altruism group. They look at ways to give money to good causes, and they're one of the main funders of election science. And that's sort of the logic that I used. This is one of our letters by a writer of a voting book called William Poundstone. And he leads off with, if you could do anything to improve the world, what would it be? So I got to age 70 and I was looking around for things that would improve the world, and improving voting methods doesn't take any money, but it would prevent splitters and spoilers and allow third parties to flourish, so that's why I chose this. This is one that shows the spoiling effect in instant runoff voting. There's several that have examples of that. And then the Center for Election Science, we took our grant money, which we could use more of, by the way, if you want to. Oh, and there's a swag up here and literature from the election science group. And we first thing we did was improve our website. So it's got huge amounts of information on it, comparing voting methods and also, everything from academic to examples. And then in the front, I have, if you like to actually see how this would be implemented in a ballot, I took the California ballot and I modified it so it sort of looks like you would get in the mail from California. So here it is, the way it would look with our current system, voting for 12 your favorite cities. So you're sort of used to that. And then under approval voting, it looks exactly the same, except instead of checking one box, you check one or more. And then under score voting, you end up with 5 stars for every selection, or 10 stars, or how many levels you think are appropriate. And then under ranked choice, you end up with a spreadsheet. There's about 15 of these up here, if you'd like to actually handle them and fill out a ballot under the different situations. Yes, so that's my presentation. Thank you.
What does the election science group think of the Electoral college system?
Yeah, that would have been my frequent question number 3. I probably should have covered that. So we have lots of opinions on other things, Electoral college, gerrymandering, but we decided to put our effort on approval voting because we think it's easy to do, whereas the Electoral college either requires a constitutional amendment or this other thing that they're working on. Where I'm supportive of that, but that's not where we're putting our effort, even though we have opinions on it. But